Good day everybody, whichever day it might be you're looking at this video, but yeah. Hi, hello. Today I will be talking about the ever-old debate that always seems to be ongoing and never getting anywhere. It's the debate of who's the GOAT of CS. And what do I want to talk about here? Well, I think the debate is something that doesn't really go anywhere when you watch it, because there's a lot of problems, there's a lot of pitfalls, there's lack of nuance when people discuss it, or be real, it's not really that much of a discussion you always see. It's more of a opinion driven shouting match very often, where people just keep yapping and telling who they think is the GOAT, and there's no real room for improvement in that sense. It's just one or none. There's no in between. There's no nuance. So I wanted to talk about that because I think this is a topic that needs a little bit more consideration, because it's an interesting topic. It's a really interesting topic, and the thing is, you can approach it from many angles. And let's begin with that. Like, one of the things that very often you see is that people tend to either be blinded by their nostalgia or by their recency bias there. And what this means is that people either rate very highly the old-timers who played very well years ago when they first started watching. It might be someone from 1.6 or Source or early CSGO. And then you have people who joined a little bit more recently, or who just are very impressed by the recent showing. This might be the people who are very much pro Taiwu, or maybe they're already trying to crown Donk as the new GOAT, or maybe there's some Monesi fans in there, who knows. But still, you can very often see that there's a lot of recency bias and the opinion shifts in this end of the spectrum, whereas on the older end, or the more nostalgia end, it seems to be very stale, and it's always the same person they throw out, and it can never really be challenged in their head. So that's the first kind of like pitfall I see, and I think it's an interesting one to think about, because it's not as simple as just saying that, okay, either you just remember the old times very fondly, or that you're just only focusing on the new results. But you can actually look at this from a little bit more deep angle, because what you can do is you can start looking at the overall comparison, the scene back in the day versus nowadays, and then you can start thinking, okay, let's see. I'm just gonna use let's throw someone everybody knows, Simple, of course. That's a good example, because if you watch this video and you have not heard of Simple, I don't think you exist. That's a disclaimer. You probably don't exist. So Simple has been a phenomenal player for God knows how long. And whenever he played, he was always a phenomenal single man army. He could do literally anything, it seemed like. He could turn any game around. No matter what he needed to do, he could do it. Now the interesting part there is, if we compare that to the current scene, let's take the often rival we put for him in the overall narratives, Taiwu, who has been a little bit more reserved in some aspects on his career, but on the other hand, he's been very consistent on the other aspects. It's, let's say, where Simple is very flashy, Taiwu might be a bit more consistent and not so flashy. Just to kind of like put a rough comparison there. But one thing that's very often forgotten of this kind of like comparison is that Simple started playing very much earlier than Taiwu. They have some overlap there. And maybe that's not the best example in this case, because they have some overlap. Maybe the example should be something a little bit more different that doesn't have the overlap. But I'm just gonna continue with this because everybody knows these two players. It's very easy to do that. So let's look at Simple's early career, for example. He played in a landscape that perhaps was not as developed as it is right now. Like, let's go back 10 years. the amount of knowledge and understanding and skill required from every individual on top level now has multiplied by a huge amount. It's incredible how much you need to actually know and be able to do to compete at the top level compared to what it used to be. And for the simplicity's sake, like let's look at back in the early CS:GO, for example, the very early days of CS:GO, because that's something I remember fondly because that's where I kind of jumped in. I don't really have much experience of like Source or 1.6 or anything like that, so I'm not gonna go and pretend that I know how games were back then, how it was back then. But early CS:GO, the tactical aspect of the game was very, how would I say it? Different. It wasn't nearly as sophisticated as it is right now. You would see people basically throwing their smokes in the top mid from the ramp on Inferno and then pushing through their own smoke willy-nilly. Was there any flashes? Probably not. It was very brawly all over the place. Whereas nowadays you have protocols for everything. Everything's kind of like planned out, practiced to perfection. You have to pick somewhere. Either you're gambling or try pick it because you have a read that's safe to catch someone off guard, or you have a flash assist, or there's a molotov, or smoke, or something that's gonna help you through it. It's very different. And why am I like going there? It's because it's hard to compare these players' careers like back then versus nowadays. Like back then, if you were top player, Forest, for example, was an amazing player back then. How can you compare Forest and his skills to the current landscape in good faith? I don't think you can really do that comparison because back then you didn't have the overall knowledge you have nowadays. You didn't have the same systems back in the place. It was still very early days. You didn't perhaps have all the coaching stuff and analysis stuff or all that stuff needed to help you understand your opponent and make your strategies very honed in and filed to the nail. And it's like you didn't have all that. You had to figure things out on the fly. You were still kind of learning as you went. So should we basically rate these people like lower or higher in that sense? Because in modern environment, if you put them in modern current environment in their prime back in the day, they're probably just an average player because their playstyle and abilities, understanding of the game was built on what was available back then, not what it is right now. Most likely these top players, like let's take like the old Fnatic and Nip when they were having their good runs early CS:GO. I don't think those lineups would do that well in modern CS if you just take them from the vacuum and plop it here. I think they would be pretty mid-team simply because it has changed so much. And what that means to the GOAT competition here is that it's an interesting one to look kind of like back then and current. Because back then, you might have been a phenomenal player on that day's standards. But does that mean that your achievements are less than someone who's a phenomenal player right now? Because, let's take a step back again. If you're a new player right now, let's say Donk, really good example because he's just owning everybody. He's a phenomenal player, inventing his Donk slides and everything. People are copying him and he's basically just started his like a pro career. The amount of knowledge and understanding of the game he had growing up. He could watch these professional players. He could compete himself in pages and whatnot in a much better way. It was also much more acceptable nowadays to be putting in the hours as a quote-unquote gamer to pursue a professional career than back then because it was still in kind of like infancy in that sense. So is it then fair to compare someone in his prime when he has all these things that can help him be better already to someone who didn't have this when they were in their early career? But at the same time, the competition is also on the kind of like same page. So Donk might have all the help he can get, but so does all the other teams he's playing against. So this also raises their floor up here. Whereas back in the day, you might have been genius on this level, but if your opponents were on the same level, then you can't really be much more than what your environment in that sense is. And that's kind of like the nuance there, like that I think is very often missing. Because it's not straightforward to say that back then these players, they were much better because, or they were much worse because the competition was worse. When you look at it as a whole, it's really hard to make these comparisons, and that's kind of like what makes it really fun, and why I think people need to kind of like be able to look past the nostalgia and their recency bias there and actually think what they do think about this themselves. Like, is some player from early CSGO or Sorcerer 1.6, if these are the like days you were watching Counter-Strike and remember all the best players and teams and so on, how do you compare these two? To kind of like get the GOAT of CS. Like you can say GOAT of 1.6 Source, CSGO, CS2. That's doable. That's a much different landscape because there's not as much variation within the game itself. There is of course some. And as I said, the development of skill and understanding goes up all the time. But even still, that is something that I think people need to be kind of like careful about. It's a very easy pitfall to make. And I think we're all guilty of it. We all have some personal bias there. I know I have. I have soft spots for certain players, whereas other players I'm a little bit more hesitant to kind of like give their praise simply because I like someone else more. Happens, human nature. That's fine. But when we have these conversations, I think it's good to kind of like look past them. And that's not all, of course. There's much more that I think needs to be looked into. One thing that I think is a pretty frustrating part sometimes to look at is that people are very fixated on the how would I phrase it? To the numbers, the ratings, all that stuff. Big number, good. Green number, great. Yeah, I mean it's a good indicator someone's doing something right when they have a good rating. But that's not really a good indicator of the overall skill they bring to the table, because that also limits what we're looking at. Like, are we only looking at, when we talk about GOAT, are we only looking at the individual skill a person has, the individual raw talent, the carry potential of a singular person? Because if we are, of course, then it's good to just look at the stats, see who's the most phenomenal player. But even that kind of like misses the nuance in a sense that if your team is doing poorly, chances are you're not getting that much that putting yourself in there, because sure you might be constantly carrying, but if you never make it to the more difficult games, let's say semifinals, finals, so on, it's hard to say how would actually fare in there. Are these numbers just group stage numbers? Which is something I remember hearing people criticize, for example, Saibu at some point of his career, that a lot of his stats and success comes from like group stages. Really good at those, but then at the playoffs he's a little bit more hit and miss, which is a fair criticism, of course. But again, that's the kind of things that are very often lost in the stream of time when people only look at the numbers and don't really see the context around them. And another thing that kind of relates to this is the role. What is your role in the team? What is it that you bring to the table? And that's also one of those things why I personally don't think it's really I don't think it's really justified that the GOAT conversation only looks at the players who have the most individual skill, but not necessarily the people behind them. And good example, let's take the IGLs for example. It's not that common to hear the names of IGLs in the GOAT conversation. You hear them in a conversation with the GOAT IGL, which, fair enough, yes, I understand, it's a very different role, but why shouldn't that also be part of the whole conversation? Who is to say that Glaive couldn't be considered one of the GOATs simply because of how much he was able to do with his lineup in Astralis back in the day. I mean, that's the kind of record that's gonna be hard to beat. Or Carrigan, who's been very consistent throughout the time. Or Apex. Hey, that's a person who has a lot of skills and knowledge that you can't really measure with just pure numbers. Like, he used to be an entry fracker back in the day. Aggressive person with skill set suitable for that. And then he switched to leading the team, became the captain of Vitality. He's getting quite a lot of achievements there. And sure, now we can argue that, well, he's getting carried by Saivu or someone like that. But then we think about, start thinking about, like, what is it that he does to facilitate that? Is he perhaps one of the key factors making Saivu so good as he is? From the interviews and clips I remember hearing and seeing, it seems like Apex knows how to kind of like push Saivu forward to get most out of him. And that's also something that's worth taking into account. Like, if you're a player who's able to shift your role during the time to fit the overall need of the game and the team, and you keep winning actively, and you keep making your star players better, making the game roll in a way that you can get most out of your own players, shouldn't that also be considered there as a conversation piece? Maybe, maybe not. You might not even think that that's relevant for this kind of like topic at all. Or maybe you're like me, who thinks that, yeah, we should actually include the minds behind the actions in this conversation. Not saying that an IGL should be the GOAT of CS, but I do think it's also worth mentioning their name when discussing the best players of all time. Because, well, there's much more than just the individual skill, in my opinion at least. That's an opinion. Don't have to agree with it. You can even disagree with it if you want. But still, if you agree or disagree with this, I do think you also need to be able to put that kind of like into words so you can put it out in the discussion, because there's no, in my opinion at least, a definitive answer of who is the best of all time, because you can look at this from so many different angles. And that's also the thing, like, are we able to look at these angles in a manner that we do justice to the topic itself? Which leads me to the next point I actually wanted to talk about. The consistency over time. How much do we rate the performance over time when we look at the greatest players of all time? Is it now I'm just gonna use Apex again here, because he's been able to reinvent himself as a player, so he's been very consistently a great player. He's never been the cream of the top, but steady level, always there, and still winning today. Is that something that's more valuable than someone who's peaking very high but then also coming very low, or not able to maintain that peak for a very long time? Like another Frenchman, Kenias, who had phenomenal years when he was playing. He was the opera to watch. God, was he good. But he's no longer playing. So how much value do we give to the length of players' careers here? Is it more valuable to be the number one for 5 years in a row and then disappear? Or is it better to be number 5 for 10 years in a row? Just to kind of like put it in perspective, like, what do we value more in this kind of conversation? And that's also why I think it's important to look at these kind of factors. Like, yeah, we look at these conversations very often. Simple and Saivu, and then more recently, m0NESY, and even Dong, because of his high peaks and his skill early in his career. And then there's some mentions, which I do think needs more mentioning. Device has been really consistent OPER for most of his career. I mean, sure, he's having a little bit of downturn right now, but at the same time, he's been playing with a lot of problems with his health, which also is actually a factor. Maybe we should consider that. How much of your own skill can you put out considering your own circumstances? Is it fair to compare a device who's always having trouble with his stomach traveling around to Zaivu, who's just having trouble with air quality? Question mark. Yeah. What do we do there? Should we take this in consideration, or do we just look the output and nothing else? Again, something to think about, I suppose. And then, what else can we talk about? I mean, I'll also mention the role a little bit, but a lot of these GOAT contenders seem to be often the AWP players, because it's easy to kind of like get your numbers up high in such a valuable role, which is not an easy role by any means. Don't get me wrong, I'm not downplaying that. But what about the rifle heroes? Nico, for example, he's been consistently great for all of his career. I don't remember by heart at the moment, but I remember looking back at his HLTV top 20 ratings. That man is consistently at the top. Like, that's amazing. Sure, he might not have many number one spots, but again, is it better to be number one for 5 years versus number 5 for 10 years? That kind of stuff. And also the role itself is more difficult to be standing out as a rifle than that it is within AWP, because AWP is often very well set up. But rifle, if you're set up or not, depends on your role and positioning a lot. If you're an entry fracker, sure, you might have your flashes with you, but you still need to be the first one in the fire. It's really hard to be consistently great in that position. You're gonna have downtime and games where nothing seems to work out. Enemies reading your movements constantly. And also, this ties back to the whole topic in the beginning. If someone is consistent for, let's say, 10 years, that means they're able to consistently evolve and adapt and learn as they go, because all their competition, they grow up learning these kind of like top level principles from very early on. But when you're starting to be like between 25 and 30 years old, learning new things and keeping up with things is not as easy as it is when you're 15 to 20 years old. That's just how the brains work. Learning gets more difficult with age. Who knew? And yeah, that's another good point there. If you're able to reinvent yourself, keep up with the game for that long, doesn't that mean that you're pretty darn good in your head, and mechanically most likely in this case? How do we value that? How do we compare that to the landscape as a whole? And these are the kind of things that I feel like very often are lost in the conversation, because people seem to always kind of like look at the individual success, certain period of time, their peak or number of MVPs they've made. Their circumstances are often not taken in consideration. Their role is often forgotten. Who even looks at the recency and nostalgia bias aside, how they've been doing throughout the years. There's so much that people don't really look at and that they forget. And that's a shame, because I think it's a very interesting conversation if it's actually done properly well and not just in a biased sense where people throw their favorite player and then keep listing their achievements or whatever, not really listening to what the other person has to say in that conversation. But yeah, I don't know. Just a little rant I had on my mind, because this is something that irks me a little bit, seeing how people discuss about these kind of things. And I don't have anything wrong with people having some bias there. You can have your favorite player. Absolutely, you should have your favorite players. You can even stand by them. I don't care. But it's more like if you're starting to throw the GOAT titles around, I think it needs to be very nuanced look at what it actually entails to be the GOAT. and what should be taken in consideration. And all of a sudden it's a very good conversation because there's no right or wrong answer. You can look this from many angles and have your opinion, and that's fine because there's no real reason or no real way to do it so that we have a definitive answer, because you can't compare these all of these factors face to face. You can't really put a rating of someone from 10 to 15 years ago, compare it to someone from today. It's a different landscape. Rating systems have changed. The way the game is played is changed. The expectations are different around your game and your personal life. It's so different and difficult to say who is actually better. Like, do you value someone who's better than all the best right now, or someone who was able to reinvent the game when everybody was still figuring things out? There's so many ways you can approach this, and I hope people kind of like think about these kind of things a little bit before making claims and statements about who they think the best person ever is, because it's not as simple as it sounds like. And when you can actually back your opinion up with some of, for example, these factors I've talked about, pick some of those, put them in the paper, and then just throw your opinion in there, because now you can actually explain why you think someone is better than somebody else. And that's gonna make the conversation much more nuanced and interesting, because now we can get to the good stuff and actually hear why people think someone is better than someone else without it being very biased and without it being solely based on something as simple as their stats or achievements, MVPs. They're good stuff to look at, but it shouldn't be just that. It needs to be a little bit more well-rounded to make sense, if that makes sense. But anyways, that's all I had for today. Thanks you all for watching, and see you next time. Cheers.